Hello again, it's Dips here, back with a fun man's birthday or Father's Day cake idea. It's a chocolate Guinness cake in the shape of a pint of beer, so it would also be perfect to serve as a bachelor or groom's cake, but I have to admit that it was St. Patrick's Day that gave me the inspiration. As well as cake decorating and sugar craft, I also love card making and paper crafts, so please do subscribe to my channel for plenty more crafting videos. But for now, let's get started with today's step-by-step cake decorating tutorial. Here I've got two deep 10cm or 4-inch chocolate Guinness cakes that I've baked, and you can find my recipe on my blog dipsdesigns.com. I've also split each cake in half. I have a small cake board. This one is square, which is all I had to hand, but I would have preferred to have used a round one. I've printed off an image of a pint of Guinness from the internet, and I've done a close-up of the Guinness Tara Harp. And I printed off 3 blocks of colour that I used as guidance to colour my icing for the body, head and harp. I'll pop the RGB and hex colour codes for these in the description box below. I also have some 20cm or 8-inch cake doweling rods, a couple of small pallet knives, and about 300 grams or 1 1/4 cups of freshly made dark chocolate ganache. So to start, I just spread a little of the chocolate ganache onto the cake board, then I stack the cakes, also spreading each layer lightly with the ganache to sandwich them together. I pushed one of my dowels down through the centre. Originally I just intended on using one dowel, but I could tell as soon as I started working on the cakes that this chocolate Guinness cake is quite soft and it would need more support, so I ended up with 3 dowels like this. And because the cake was so soft, once I'd stacked and dowelled it, I popped it into the freezer for a good hour before I moved on to this next stage. I've cut out my pint of Guinness image, which I just used as a reference for the overall shape. Then I used a serrated knife to round off the top of the cake. And I trimmed around the bottom of the cake to create more of a glass shape. Then I cleared away the crumbs and coated the cake in a layer of chocolate ganache. Although my cake was still cold from the freezer, it was quite crumbly, so I worked carefully, and if I had started to have real problems, I would have popped it back into the freezer to chill again. However, don't worry at this stage about the ganache being ultra smooth. All I wanted at this point was a good covering of ganache. Now I spotted that my cake had developed the sort of tilt that I can also get after a couple of pints of Guinness. So I decided to fix this with a small wedge of sugar paste. That's better. The cake is now completely covered with ganache, and I used an offset palette knife which I dipped in hot water then dried to smooth out the ganache, removing any excess as I went until the cake surface was smooth and even like this. Before the ganache set though, I trimmed the dowels down to size. To do this, I used my dedicated food pliers to pull each one out, trimmed it to length and reinserted it back into the cake, flush to the surface. Then I used a little more ganache to cover the tops. I returned the cake into the fridge to chill and for the ganache to really firm up. In my case, this happened to be overnight, but I would allow a good 3 to 4 hours if you're not leaving it overnight. Now, as the ganache is so well chilled, I just painted it all over with a little diluted royal icing in order to ensure that the fondant icing stuck to it, which is the next thing to do. I used a combination of dark brown along with a little touch of black food colouring paste to colour my sugar paste to this deep rich brown. I also worked in a pinch of Tylo powder to help strengthen the paste. Then I rolled it to the thickness of a pound coin and I cut a rectangle that was 1 centimetre or half an inch taller and about 5 centimetres or 2 inches longer than the height and circumference of the cake. I draped this around the cake, at this stage just lightly smoothing it into place. Now obviously I didn't hit record here, but once I'd got to where the two ends met, I overlaid one on top of the other, then used a knife to trim away the overlap where they met. I removed the excess from the top layer, then peeled this back to remove the excess from the underneath layer. I also cut away the excess paste around the base too. Now you can see that I used the warmth of my fingers to press the paste together to remove the seam. I also used a little diluted royal icing as a glue to knit together the top of the paste. So I just kept smoothing the surface, using the warmth of my fingers to smooth out any kinks or bumps. And without stretching the paste, just moulded the curve of the paste at the top into a pint glass shape. Then I lightly used a smoothing paddle to smooth the rim of the paste, like this, and I continued to use the paddles to smooth the surface of the paste. And I want to show you what the top of the cake looks like. As you can see better from this angle that I've very gently moulded the paste slightly inwards, similar to the top of a pint glass. Now set aside either overnight or for 8 to 12 hours for the fondant to dry out. So here I have some edible confectioner's glaze. You can either buy this in small bottles like this, or you can also now source it in a spray can too. I had this nice flat brush and I poured about 2 teaspoons of the glaze into a pallet, and then I simply painted a thin coat of glaze onto the cake using long upright brush strokes. I was careful not to overload the brush with the glaze, used up and down strokes until I had an even thin layer of glaze all over the cake. I set the cake aside for the glaze to dry, which didn't take long, but in the meantime I worked on the Tara Harp motif. Now if you're clever with a piping bag and royal icing, then I'm sure you could pipe this design out over clear acetate. I'm not so confident with my piping skills, and I don't think I'm alone with that, so I wanted to show you a cheats way to create this motif that is quite easy. So I coloured a golf ball sized piece of fondant with some ivory paste colouring until it closely matched my colour sample. I could have used flour modelling paste instead of fondant, but I didn't have any to hand, so I just used a pinch of Tylo powder to strengthen my sugar paste instead. Then I rolled it out and used a simple cutter for the alphabet letter V and stamped out 2 V shapes. The reason I've done this is, if you look at the Tara Harp logo, the outline actually looks like 2 interlocking V shapes. Now you can see with the very first V shape, I've trimmed away and thinned down one of the sides. Now for the next V shape, the first thing I did was use a small circle cutter to just round out the base of the V. Once I'd stamped the rounded shape, I used a small sharp knife to trim away the excess. Then I wanted to stamp a small hole, and as I didn't have a cutter as small as I needed, I used the end of a round piping nozzle and extended the cut into the base of the V. Can you see? I referred to my picture to help me work out how to shape the V, and if I needed to trim away any more of the paste. I double checked that the 2 V's locked together as I wanted before moving on to the next step, which was to hand roll out 5 tiny thin sausages of modelling paste. I applied a little diluted royal ice into the back of my two V shapes and along the adjoining edges and press them together like so. You can see I'd stuck one of the sausages in place already, but now I added the rest, and a pair of tweezers can really help with a fiddly job like this. Once it was finished, I carefully turned it the right side up and used some edible gold lustre powder to dust the harp, and then I set this aside for a couple of hours to dry and harden. For the distinctive head on a pint of Guinness, I used royal icing. However, the head of a pint of Guinness is more creamy and definitely not bright white, so I used a little of my ivory colouring paste to colour the royal icing. I also added an eighth of a teaspoon of vanilla extract for flavour and a quarter of a teaspoon of glycerin, which prevented the royal icing from setting rock hard. I added the icing to the top of the cake and used a palette knife to gently smooth it out. You can see now why it's important to give the brown fondant time to dry out and harden before adding the royal icing head. You can see that I used the palette knife to create a dome to the head, but I didn't want it to be completely smoothed out. Next, I carefully applied a little royal icing to the back of the harp and very, very gently placed it onto the cake. In retrospect, I think I should have used a piping bag and nozzle to dot the icing onto the back of the harp. As you can see, some of the excess, but I did carefully clean away as much of this as I could with my Dresden tool. And here's my cake completely finished. If you're wondering, it took about 4 to 5 hours in total to make, but this was spread over 3 days as it had 2 overnight sets. If you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up and please subscribe. You might like to watch more of my crafting videos like these. I'm also absolutely thrilled when you take the time to comment as to what you think and ask questions. Thank you for spending your precious time with me, and bye for now.